Welcome to Kingston Writers Fest. My name is Barbara Bell, and I'm Artistic Director of the festival. I'm very pleased tonight to be presenting somewhat of an experiment. Reading men, books, and beer, or it might be wine and words. We're going to find out what the guys order. It is my pleasure to introduce the authors. I'm going alphabetically. Winner of numerous awards, Stephen Heighton's widely lauded 4 novels, 3 short story collections, and 6 poetry collections have been translated into 10 languages. His novel Afterlands was a best of year selection in Canada and abroad. His most recent books are The Nightingale Won't Let You Sleep and The Waking Comes Late, a poetry collection which received the Governor General's Award for Poetry. Pasha Malla's writing has appeared in numerous journals, magazines, and anthologies. His first book, the short story collection The Withdrawal Method, won both the Danuta Gleed Literary Award and the Trillium Book Award, and was shortlisted for the Commonwealth Writers' Prize. The author of a collection of poetry, 2 novels, People Park, and Fugue States, Pasha Malla. Linden MacIntyre is a Canadian journalist, broadcaster, and novelist. He has won Gemini Awards, an International Emmy, and numerous other awards for writing and journalistic excellence, including the Scotiabank Giller Prize for The Bishop's Man. He was well known for many years for his investigative journalism on CBC's The Fifth Estate. His most recent novel is The Only Cafe. Please welcome the authors.
Is there any significance to this particular configuration?
No, I just thought I'd grab
You
the,
just decided who
This is our
said.
line. I'm our left winger.
Right.
I'm very centrist.
Right.
So where does that leave Stephen?
right wing. Okay, so you guys will take a knee once I start.
Terry Follis was on a platform the other night, and he was talking about that he, as a young guy, he played hockey with Stephen Harper. And
Wow.
guess what position Stephen played?
Right
Okay.
wing. Right. I guess. Yeah. I'd like to apologize for drinking wine.
I'm going to stop.
There's a
I'm
couple
going to stop
of
drinking
big jars of beer up here too, but I think I'm going to drink wine. And Pasha, we're going to talk about that a little later, right? The whole setup, the beer thing.
You're deconstructing gender through refusing the drink of choice.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah. Very progressive.
That's not very right wing, though, is it? I think it's,
Because this is unmoderated, this panel's unmoderated, there's no moderator. We thought it would just be, really free flowing. I'm going to read first. I'm going to talk a bit about my book, read for, 15 minutes or so. And then we can either have a bit of a discussion or move right on to the next reading, Pasha's. And then Linden will read last. So after I read, if you want to ask questions or if we might start talking. And I want to thank my sponsor, Clinton Dentistry, because I want to mention that they, earlier today when I did a poetry reading, I heard that they'd sponsored me again, and I was really touched. I can't help feeling, though, they sponsor me year after year because they keep hoping I'll actually go back and get another checkup. It's been such a long time. So if Robert and Sue are out there in the audience, I promise it'll be one of these years. So read up here. Usually, before I read, there's a bit of comic business as I try to find some reading glasses, because this is a fairly new thing, and I usually don't bring them, but tonight I actually did bring a pair, so I'm not going to have to ask someone there for drugstore cheaters. So here's a really short passage. Throughout this book, this novel, there are really brief passages that I think of as canticles, which don't really have much to do with the plot or the story, but just kind of create a sort of framework. But let me just tell you a couple things about the book first. If you go on Google Maps and Google Varosha, Google satellite view, you'll see an overhead view, a satellite view of a city that no longer exists. It ceased to exist 42 years ago. And on the bottom of the screen, it says, Varosha, Cyprus, population 0. This was a thriving resort community until 1974, when a Turkish invasion, I won't give you all the political details, Turkish invasion ended all that. The Turks conquered the northern third of the island and also grabbed Varosha because it was so important to the Greek Cypriot economy. They figured the Greek Cypriots would bargain to get it back. Greeks being Greek refused to bargain, and it's been sitting there degrading and decomposing for 42 years. So now the city is unsalvageable. A lot of the larger buildings, the hotels and apartment blocks have collapsed. Most of the city is overgrown with vines, bougainvillea, creepers, and so on. When I read about this place, I thought this is where I'm going to set my next novel. And it says population 0 on the Google satellite view, but I intend to populate this ghost city with a cast of deserters, refugees, misfits, outcasts, who are somehow surviving, in fact, thriving in the heart of the ruins, which is in fact possible. It wouldn't be possible in Kingston 40 years after the city was deserted, but it is possible on Cyprus. It's semi-tropical. The deserted city, the dead zone, is full of animals and fruit trees and nut trees, all sorts of things. So there is a small group of people surviving in the heart of the ruins. And I'll get to that part in a second. Here is a passage from about the middle of the book. Every language has a word that expresses its meaning better or more beautifully than the equivalent word in any other tongue. Sometimes the beauty is conceptual, as in the case of the German Lebenslüge, or life lie, the convenient, if sometimes fatal fiction around which you build a life, or a nation shapes its identity. Sometimes the beauty is acoustical. Listen to the Greek for winter, chimonas. What other word so encloses the cold season in its very sounds? That long middle vowel echoes the moaning of north winds and evokes the O of Boreas's blue-lipped, puffing mouth in those drawings in the upper corners of classical maps. And the guttural CH of the word's opening, a harsh, raw, throat-clearing sound, the rasp of winter illness, colds and coughs, then the dwindling hiss of the last syllable, snow blowing over a sheet of ice. Or take the Turkish for friend, arkadaş. You could say a beautiful sounding word for a beautiful concept and leave it at that, but there's more. Friend, or even ami or philos, seems too brief, clipped, and uncomplicated to house all the qualities of a true friend. Arkadaş is a roomier word, an atrium of rich sounds, the last syllable lingering in a shh that extends the life of the utterance, delaying the silence to follow. A secretive sound, too. Hush, say nothing to the world about this friendship. It's ours alone. And in the opening arc, you might hear arc, the span and scope of a lifelong connection. But mainly you hear how the word prolongs itself in the same way that love, never a great respecter of borders, can extend beyond death. I actually got interested in Cyprus, or learned something about it years and years ago, long before I got the idea to write the novel. So maybe the seed was planted then. It was the summer of 1974, the summer of the Turkish invasion. And so I'm in the kitchen reading a book, as I was constantly doing at that age. My mother was making Greek food at the stove. She was Greek. And the radio was on. The radio was on all the time that summer because of the war and the conflict in Cyprus. My mother had a lot of relatives in Greece, including people in the military, and she was worried that Greece was going to get involved on the side of the Greek Cypriots, and then there'd be an actual war between Turkey and Greece, and it might spread through the Middle East. So the Greek radio station from the Danforth in Toronto was constantly on, alternating between lugubrious Greek love songs and the Greek news, this urgent news from the Levant. So anyway, for some reason, my father comes into the kitchen to call my mother away. Maybe it's the phone or something. And we're listening to the radio, my father and I, and it's just a lugubrious Greek love song. He's stirring the food, and suddenly the music stops in mid-song, and this urgent voice starts bellowing. It sounds like it sounds like a bulletin or something, hide in the basement, you're about to be bombed or something. And my father yells, "Lambie, Lambie, come back. I think Turkey and Greece have gone to war." So my mother runs back into the kitchen, stops for a second, looks down at the linoleum, listening to the radio, and says, "No, it's just some guy selling carpets on the Danforth." So that was my first. This is the first thing I knew of Cyprus was that summer, learning about the war, and then I forgot about it for years and years until I guess 2013 or so. I got the idea for this novel when I read about Varosha. So I'll just read it. I think I'm going to just read a couple of really short sections instead of the slightly longer, like 10-minute section I was going to read. In fact, I think what I'll do right now is read a passage that has to do with Charon, because Charon is an important figure in Linden MacIntyre's novel as well. A very different Charon, not the ferryman who takes the dead across the river Styx to Hades in ancient Greek mythology. But here's a passage about that Charon. And as I mentioned at my book launch here in Kingston a few months ago, and forgive me for those, a few of you may have been there, I said my current favorite toast, which I discovered while researching this novel, is Napathanio Charos, which means death to the ferryman. Charos is Charon, the ferryman. So you toast your friend, you have to look them in the eye and say, Napathanio Charos, death to the ferryman, or as I translate it, may death drop dead. A wonderful toast. So here's a short passage about Charon. To the ancient Greeks, death meant the loss of everything. What Charon ferried across the river into Hades was no immortal soul, no self-aware survivor enjoying a post-mortem promotion to a better state. At death, a person's vital elements, eros, bodily desire, themos, a spirited sense of will and worth, and psyche, consciousness, dispersed and left only a faint remnant, a shadow with no name, no character, no memory of its former condition. This eidolon existed, if it could be said to exist at all, in a state of perpetual and wandering coma. When the dead appeared to loved ones in dreams, it was this shadow that the dreamer saw. Son of night, brother of sleep. As for the shades themselves, they didn't dream, as if they were stalled forever in that deepest delta wave phase of sleep, when sleepers know no more than the dead. I think I'll finish up by just reading the opening 3 pages of the book, which is essentially a kind of interview between a patient who ends up being one of the 2 protagonists of the novel, Leah Strophanis, a Greek-Canadian soldier who's been traumatized in Afghanistan, and a doctor. And by the way, Canadian soldiers who were rotated back through Cyprus before they came back to Canada. All of them were rotated back through Cyprus. They had 2 weeks there, but those who were, injured or psychologically damaged in combat sometimes spent a lot longer in Paphos in Cyprus, across the island from the deserted city, being treated there. And that's the case with my character, Elias. "How long is it then since you have slept?" the doctor asked. Elias looked up at the ceiling, trying to recall. The blades of the fan turned listlessly. In fact, they seemed to be slowing, as if the power had just cut out again. "Surely you've slept a little since we last met." "It was yesterday, right?" "Yesterday morning." "Okay. About 30 hours ago," the doctor said. "I've passed out a couple of times for a while. I tried not to." "So you did not remain asleep? You had the dream again?" "Yes." "You wish to describe it again, or the incident itself?" "They're almost the same," he says. "It's not really a dream, more like a video of an atrocity." "As I said, this is typical of your condition, diagnostic actually. However, no, I don't," Elias said. "Pardon me?" "Want to describe it again." Drops of sweat glistened on the raw-looking scalp under the doctor's blonde comb-over. Thick glasses magnified his colorless, pink-rimmed eyes, which blinked often. "Avoiding sleep, however," he said. "It's understandable, but I fear that such Such a practice can only make the matter worse. I've never needed much sleep. Men of your kind often boast of how little sleep they need. You're not meant to mock your patients, are you? You do look tired, the doctor said, as if he hadn't heard, though in fact you seem somewhat improved today. Still, I apologize. Frankly, I don't feel that bad. I feel relieved, Elias said, because I'm awake now, not asleep and reliving things. Insomnia is a fucking joy in comparison to that. Self-inflicted sleep deprivation, not insomnia, the doctor said. What did you mean by men of my kind? Why do you ask? Because I have no idea myself anymore. Large men, robust, the doctor said, mesomorphic. Elias Stephanus looked out the window over the doctor's shoulder, a white pebble beach, the calm Mediterranean pixelated with sunlight. The Army was using this former student residence on the west coast of Cyprus to treat personnel on stress leave from the war. Last night, while Elias silently performed yet another set of push-ups on the cold cement floor of his room trying to hold off sleep, the patient in the next room screamed catastrophically. That was helpful. A few extra hours of adrenalized alertness. It's funny how people think they can look at your body and know your soul, Elias said. That magnified blinking again. In a faster, fainter voice, the doctor said, mais oui, you are quite right. One should never assume a correlation between, how could I put it? Elias yawned helplessly, gapingly, a pathological yawn that convulsed his whole body. Sorry, Dr. Boudreau, he said at last. I really do enjoy talking to you. Perhaps you will be able to sleep better on your weekend away? I hope so. You're going across the island to visit family? Distant relatives, Elias said. How is your Greek now? Etsi ki etsi. If you don't mind my saying, you look really tired yourself. Yes. The doctor's blinking made it seem he was trying to communicate something in a sort of binary code, words he couldn't bring himself to say. It's not simply this heat wave, the doctor said. Normally one grows used to working with the traumatized, yet I seem to find it increasingly... What am I saying? I must not say such things. The fan still gave the illusion of perpetually slowing without ever stopping. In any case, Master Corporal, I wish you a peaceful weekend. Don't call me that, okay? And please don't speak of what happened in Kandahar. I wouldn't know how to speak of it. And bear in mind it was not your fault, not anyone's fault. The doctor subdued his twitching by closing his eyes for a second, then opening them wide. It was simply an accident, I know. And don't forget your medication. No way, I love my medication. Dizzy, seeing double, Elias tried to focus his gaze. Out the window in the distance, a sunburned figure in a swimsuit, who seemed impossibly to be the doctor, appeared on the shore and walked into the sea. So I'll stop there. Thanks very much. Yeah. Well, now we can talk a bit, or you can read, or we can even take a few questions from the audience. I think we have a question. That might get us talking.
I love your talk about words, and I've been with a couple of Kukulitzas in my time. But talking about language also hides what doesn't exist. The very doctor who said maybe
French Canadian, Boudreau, yeah.
But in French, there are two words for pride. There's one
orgueil,
bad pride, and fierté, which is good pride. So, but we don't have that in English.
Right.
So what's interesting, I really like your insights, but also the synesthesia of drinking at the same time that we're inebriated. It's also the reading.
Oh, you mean because we're drinking right now?
Yeah, I mean,
this is the first time I've actually been allowed to drink on stage.
Where I come from, it's impolite to drink when nobody else is drinking. So I don't want people to be shy.
Then you throw it at the chimney.
Yeah, well, you can do that. But I'm just going to say, if I'm up there reading and somebody is thirsty, go to the bar and get a drink. I'm not going to be offended, okay? So, like, there's no need of sitting here like church which is, I'm getting that feel now, but
Really? So I guess Linden MacIntyre is saying this is a great time to go get a drink if you want to get one. There, we got some.
see?
No,
So,
we're well supplied
yeah,
up here.
and people will deliver to us, which I think is pretty fine. Makes writing books worthwhile at the end of the day.
Since we're talking about drinking and the idea that this was men, books, and beer, Pasha, do you want to bring up the thing we were talking about at dinner?
Yeah, there's a couple things I wanted to talk about, but it is, I mean, the idea of inebriation, that, I mean, your book's is a bar. Your character is drugged through a lot of the book.
Yeah.
He's in pain, he's injured, he's suffering with PTSD. Is that fair to say? That's
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
and my characters are constantly getting high and drunk. And I think it's like, it's an interesting component of a kind of masculinity that is used to mask feeling. Like, whether it's
Absolutely.
physical feeling, emotional feeling. And I just wondered if either of you could speak to that.
Well, see,
Or it's- sorry.
sorry about that. I didn't think your characters drank half enough. I mean, there was one guy who was your prototypical big white lout childhood friend who drank his brains out whenever he had an
You
opportunity.
sound like the Michelin Man.
but
Racially white.
when I think of wakes and funerals and mourning and grieving among my people, there's a lot of alcohol, and your people are extremely abstemious in that sense.
Oh, I don't know.
Well, they drink a little beer, but
Yeah, I feel like that I feel like the characters are drinking kind of through the entire book. And there's one character who smokes pot through the entire book.
yes.
Or at least he does until he gets to India and he can't find it. Which means he's looking hard enough because there's a lot of it. So yeah, no, I feel like this is like it's a trope in fiction, a kind of fiction about a kind of male experience, and like it goes back beyond, like, to the Greeks, and
Sure.
like we see it in very kind of prototypical male writing like Hemingway.
But you see, I think part of the trope is that there's always an awkward space between the son and the father. And it is
Absolutely.
often most easily bridged with a glass of booze once he's become tolerant of your. And I know the last social event I spent with my father many, many years ago, we got plastered. And the next day, in what turns out to be our last time together, we spent it in a pub. And it just seemed to be the elixir that sort of opened up this difficult space that existed between us, and so I'm always very sympathetic to the social value of drinking, especially in times of stress.
I am too, and I'm wondering if do you think this is something you'd find in almost any culture?
Yes,
That
sir.
men and their sons often need some way to
Well,
sort of
I
loosen
mean, there are
things up,
cultures
you know?
that sort of frown on alcohol.
But even they might need it. It wouldn't be
Yeah.
available to them. But they might kind of wish there was something.
Yeah, and there might be something that's not alcoholic, but it could be whatever. But I do believe that as a generalization, that there is always a period in the relationship between a father and a son, and even a mother, but that where there has to be a kind of a dismantling of what has sort of grown up in between them, and in some cases, you had a very remote dad, and a very thoughtful son, and in the book.
Yeah, because the actual son isn't that thoughtful.
But no, I had a father who, because of economics, was away all the time. I mean, the only way he could earn a living was to go off to the wilderness and do that. So when we became adults, or I became an adult, and he already was one, there was a communication problem. There was a kind of a experiential gap.
Right.
That we couldn't sort of sit around and talk about Christmases and birthdays and family occasions because we didn't have many.
Right.
So we would break it all down and dissolve it in booze, and then eventually we would get to a place that wasn't necessarily maudlin and sentimental, and I wish it had gone on a lot longer, but it didn't. But it was it gave us a place to start something that we never quite finished.
Mm-hmm. It does. I mean, it does feel like in male relationships, it does. I agree. It's necessary. It's like with my oldest friends, like the only time we're really, like I love you, man, it comes out after like 14 pints of beer. So,
Hard not to have the man at the end, right? It's because
like, it's just enough distance that it's like
it's a little rug
doesn't
pull.
speak to
Yeah.
the actual eroticism of those relationships. Like even male friendships between two straight men, there is an eroticism there, and I think it's something that we deny, and that alcohol allows us to access, so that we can then be physically intimate, or we can be emotionally intimate.
Up to a point.
And that's what my book kind of.
Well, it blurs the point.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I feel like I love beer. It's great. I love wine. I like to have some drinks, but I feel sometimes that the way in which we use it, and I and my male friends use it as a way to break a barrier. It feels like it speaks to an inadequacy that we could be working a little harder to do without booze.
So you sometimes wonder what would it be like not to actually need that?
Yeah.
Because I think one way to look at human history, I don't think it's just about men interacting. I think one way to look at human history is this long quest for different forms of anesthesia. And I sort of long to reach a place where I no longer am reaching for something that will take the edge off, fears or just
But isn't everything a struggle against inadequacy?
Yeah, sure.
And we can use all the help we get. And I don't sort of reject help. Well, I would rather read a book of philosophy or go to a self-help group. I'm going to take my inadequacies to the place where they're best melted down. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm gonna read a bit.
He's you're young, Pasha. You're young. You'll learn.
So I teach. Steve, you're taller than me, apparently. Who knew? Thank you. Is that loosened? There we go. So I teach at a number of universities because I have sessional jobs, and like many of us, I kind of scramble around. And one of the things I've learned in my teaching is that trigger warnings are an important element of when you have a group of people, that it's important to provide just a sort of heads up that if there's going to be difficult material or something potentially challenging or offensive. So this book has a lot of things in it that may be offensive to people. And I just want to give everybody a heads up that I'm about to sing. You'll know when it happens because yeah. So I should tell you what the book's about. I mean, I assume everyone here's read it, but I'll give you a heads up. So the novel is about a youngish man who is the host of a books interview show on a national radio broadcaster that may or may not be the CBC, but seems a lot like the CBC. And the book opens with the funeral of his father, who passes away suddenly. His father is from Kashmir. And in his father's personal effects and belongings, Ash, the main character, finds a sort of half-written, unfinished novel. And it seems to take place in Kashmir, and Ash becomes interested in it and interested in this man that he didn't know very well. And but ultimately refuses to participate in what he thinks is a kind of cliche of this sort of first-generation Canadian son chasing after meaning and going to the homeland and everything else. He ends up there anyway through a sort of unfortunate set of circumstances. But the scene I'm going to read is he has basically been incapable of accessing the grief that he's feeling and the sadness, and it turns into misanthropy. and hostility, and he gets himself into some trouble, and he returns to Toronto where he lives, more or less disgraced. He may or may not have lost his job. And this is the scene where he comes back to his condo building on the lakeshore in Toronto. And I don't think you need to know anything else. I think other than that, it's kind of a self-contained sort of moment. And it does have a musical interlude, which I've given you a heads up about, so be prepared. I'm not a good singer. Ash's building shared facilities with a neighboring hotel, and he liked to head over for a swim just before the pool closed for the night. There was rarely anyone using it so late, and he swam lengths until his anxiety stilled, and all that remained was the simple repetition of stroking from one end to the other. This was the first step of a ritual, herbal tea, the book of disquiet, cataloging the day's ignominies that coaxed himself to sleep. The pool had that sterile quality particular to everything in hotels. Its surface was as flat and taut as cling wrap. The smell was ammonal. A spectral reflection shimmered up the walls. Mercifully, tonight Ash was alone. He left his towel, flip-flops, t-shirt, and keys in the little pile and padded up to the edge. Dipped a toe, bathwater warm. He eased in and drifted down, limbs hanging, touched bottom, bounced off like an astronaut on the moon, hovered, floated, had no thoughts. Let the moment extend. Gradually his lungs tightened. The tension spread through his chest, to his neck, into his throat, up through his cheeks, until the follicles of his hair seemed to constrict, and at last, in a breathless surge, he planted his feet and launched upward, bursting out of the water, swallowed air, then dove again and flogged his way toward the deep end. He was a weird swimmer. Bridge, that's his father, too, could never be described as naturally aquatic, plunging about with a unique hybrid of front crawl, breaststroke, and doggy paddle, and surfacing intermittently with a blowhole-ish sputter. Mona, that's his sister, did an excellent imitation of their dad's swimming, rendered as frantic digging in the waves for something lost. Now Ash performed the routine without irony. It felt natural. This was just how he swam. After a couple laps, he stopped and, panting and clinging to the side, detected a sudden presence at the far end of the pool. A boy, maybe 10 years old, stood there with a lip of belly crumpling his belly button. Oh, that's not good writing. I should edit that in the next edition after this one sells out. That's with a pink... with a... yeah. With a wishful thinking. Giller Prize nod would have been nice. Anyway... Really bumps the sales, eh, Linden? Stood there with a pink lip, crumpling his belly button and folding down over his trunks. Hi, said this boy. Hi, said Ash. Where are your parents? And they sent me down for a swim to tire me out. The boy seemed embarrassed. I get hyper sometimes before bed. Me too, said Ash. Come on in, the water's warm. If this sounded as creepy as Ash feared it did, the boy didn't seem to care. He rocked back and lunged into a mid-air tuck, crashing lopsided into the water. Waves sloshed the deck. He surfaced looking proud. That's my cannonball. Nice, said Ash. You do one. A cannonball? Yeah. Ah, okay, said Ash with a grin. The scamper, the launch, the scrunch, the plunge, the fleeting abandon, the joy. Whoa, said the boy, standing now in the shallow end. That was amazing. Ash bobbed amid his own wake. Years of practice, friend. You'll get there. The boy turned solemn. I live in New Zealand. Lots of chances to cannonball there, I bet. I guess, except everyone at my school calls me Tubby Canuck. That's mean. Is everyone mean in New Zealand? I'm from here, though, Etobicoke, Ontario. We moved for my dad's work. He teaches university. The one here was U of T Mississauga, but the new one's called... I forget. We live in Christchurch, like Jesus Christ, like church. There's a lot of churches there, holy. What about your mom? Worrying this might also seem creepy, Ash added, mine's a professor too, like your dad. My mom's a teacher, except of kids, except she can't teach in New Zealand because of her experience. The boy shook his head. He'd got it wrong, because of her lack of experience. Even though she taught in Canada, they won't let her teach in New Zealand because she's never taught in New Zealand. But how can you get experience if they won't give you any? They say she has to go back to school, but she just stays home all day and reads. That doesn't sound so bad, said Ash. She likes it better here. I do too, said the boy. Do your parents let you swim on your own all the time? The boy shrugged. I do lots of my own on Christchurch. I'm independent. I ride the bus. I go to the movies. It's not a big deal. What if there's no lifeguard? Well, they said just to stay in the shallow end. Oh, gotcha. Also, said the boy, they're fighting. Flopping onto his face, the boy floated as if searching for something on the bottom of the pool. Ash waited for him to right himself, and when he did, asked, "So when are you flying home?" "Tomorrow, but via L.A. so I can check out Hollywood." "Oh, is that so?" said Ash. "Yeah, the Hollywood sign, the Walk of Fame, the Chinese Theater, Burbank Studios, all of it. I'm going to be a director and move there when I'm older. I've already got my own DV camera and everything. I've got Final Draft, I've got Final Cut Pro. But why Hollywood?" said Ash. "You can make movies anywhere." The boy laughed. "Because that's where you have to go if you want to make it. Geez, you don't know very much for an adult, do you?" "I know they make more movies in India than in Hollywood." Ash wasn't sure if this was true. "What kind of movies?" "Bollywood movies. Fun movies." Ash ducked his chin, took in a mouthful of water, and spat it out in a fountain. "Lots of singing and dancing." "Ew," said the boy. "I hate musicals." "No, these are different kinds of musicals. They're kind of crazy. Do you like mustaches?" "There are a lot of mustaches." "We lived in India, too," said the boy. "Really? You did?" "Yeah, when I was 5. I don't remember it, though. My dad was on sabbatical. We had a servant who had 6 fingers, 4 fingers and 2 thumbs." "That's a lot of thumbs," said Ash. "On one hand!" The boy looked pensive, though maybe I just saw that in a movie. "That happens to me sometimes." Ash whip-kicked to the side of the pool and clung to the edge. "Where in India did you live?" "I don't know. I told you I was 5. It was dirty." "Sure, it's dirty." Ash sensed the conversation dwindling. "I'm Indian," he announced. This had the required effect. The boy eyed him with renewed interest. "No, you're not. You don't look Indian or sound Indian." "Well, I am." "Nope, you're Canadian." "Well, I'm that too." "You can't be both. I live in New Zealand, but I'm only Canadian." Here the boy seemed to ready himself for something grand, and yet Ash was not prepared for what came belting out. Ready? "Oh, Canada, our home and native land." "Do you think they should change it to our home on native land?" said Ash. "Right? True patriot love," the boy sang, his hand on his chest, standing stalwart in the pool with the water sloshing around his gut. "In all thy son's command." Ah, what the hell, Ash thought, hauling himself up onto the deck. With glowing hearts he sang, disbelieving himself, even as the words spilled from his mouth. Where were they coming from? He'd not sung the national anthem in years. Even when the boy switched to French, he remained right alongside, clueless as to what the words meant. Car ton bras s'est porté l'épée, il s'est porté la croix. And they sang and they sang. Ash with one eye on the exit, should the kid's parents appear, should anyone appear, and find him here belting out this ridiculous, nonsensical song with everything he had, with all the patriot love in his heart.
I thought the singing was fine, man. That was, you have to warn us.
I don't really get, well, that's not true. I live in a perpetual state of being nervous, but I don't usually get more nervous when I read, but that really, I was like shaking.
Because of the singing coming up? Yeah, it was good. I love you, man. Yeah. So.
Yeah, this word bromance is something that I've heard. I mean, I hear it a lot, and it's something that I've been asked about in relation to this book. And what does that mean? Like, what does that mean to you guys? This word bromance.
Well, it kind of gets back to what you were saying. You were talking about how between male friends too, there's a connection that you could call erotic in the sense eros just means a spirit of connection. It doesn't have to be sexual. But even that much is too much for most men to acknowledge. So bromance, I think, is suggesting that there is some sort of, a guy's got a crush on another guy, not necessarily in a sexual sense, but just, finds him interesting in a way that guys aren't supposed to. Yeah,
Whatever.
Well, men are supposed to sit side by side, not
Yeah.
even really looking at each other, and I think it's kind of sad that we feel it has to be that way.
Yeah, I mean, sexual men. I mean, let's,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Sure. So, I mean, that is based in a whole kind of, homophobia that is a kind of weakness, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, so I think that, even those of us who think of ourselves as progressive, I think this is stuff, men, stuff that maybe is worth thinking about, right? Like the way that we've kind of normalized a certain kind of behaviors. Yeah, anyway.
Well, I think that a lot of it has to do with public exhibition. And men will hug each other, but...
With 2 pats.
Well, you know what? That's better than nothing. I was at a wake once. A friend of mine died, and he was a fisherman, and he was a macho guy, and his macho fisherman brother was there. And being from Toronto, this was in the East Coast, and so I went to the wake. They have, like, the dead person there, and the coffin is open, and everybody walks by it, and the family sort of stands near that. So anyway, I come up to his macho brother, and I sort of just fell into Toronto-ism. And I reached out to hug him, and his arm went up like that.
Wow.
Right.
You know, he blocked me.
Yeah.
And I thought, that's okay.
Sure.
I just invaded his space, and there's no circumstance, even this, that permits me to do that. So that's fair enough.
Yeah.
But he didn't hit me.
Right.
And so I do believe that there's a long tradition. I don't know where it begins. I know that among military people, they get very mushy with each other in certain occasions. And men, I lived in mining camps with men, and people get pretty declarative at times about what they feel. But I do believe that there is this deep-seated fear among certain generations of men of the homo sexual kind of taboo, and I think that does get in the way. But that's gradually, I believe, disappearing.
Yeah, I think younger generations are doing better than my generation.
Yeah. I mean, little boys
totally.
routinely come home from school now and say, I'm going to marry John, my buddy in grade 9. It's perfectly fine. Little girls come home and say, I'm going to marry Elizabeth.
Yeah,
And I think that, I think we're getting to a place where we don't get completely, blocked off each other because of this stuff. But you're very, very silent for a progressive young
no, I'm just thinking about it.
metrosexual guy.
Not that metro. Yeah. Danny.
I think it's partly about the fact that we connect emotions with the female side of the gender.
Exactly.
It is about we male in general feel that connecting emotions to themselves degrade them in a way, reduce from their manhood in a way. And actually, what we're doing is we're blocking a lot of emotional maturity by denying ourselves the ability to actually connect with one another, and we connect everything to sex in a way, which is horrible and stupid and it doesn't have to exist. Like, 2 men can hug and hang out, and
Yeah.
one of them is really sad, so needs a hug. Where's the problem with that? But there's always that moment when we have any physical connection that we turn it into a sexual connection, which also speaks to the mind of the man.
I mean, I think you might be saying, and correct me if I'm reading too much into it, that every man has a woman suppressed within. And we have learned over a lot of time to keep her in her place and not let her out. And I think, eventually we are becoming less inhibited about the expression of what we consider to be the female side of her personality.
I think gender is a spectrum. Everybody can fall on a part of that spectrum. There's no such a thing anymore as one gender that is the man and one gender that is the woman. Somebody is always on a percentage of where they land on that spectrum. And we just connect somehow positivity to the abilities of men to be macho. You repeated the word macho a minute ago multiple times to describe positively your friend. And we say that positively while we're thinking about emotions, and we think about that as men negatively, in a negative way, that having that, this is invading my space, this is too much, you're tapping me twice on the shoulder and then you release, as you were saying a minute ago. So it just, I feel like we should come to the point where we respect our gender identity the besides the fact that we have biological sex in a certain way. We just should accept the fact that our emotions are connected to our gender in a way.
I think
I was just thinking about examples of when men feel it's okay to hug each other. And you see it a lot on the sport field, football players and whatnot, that, somebody does something good, they're all, grabbing each other.
that's okay because they're on the field, yeah.
Each other on the ass and, hugs and everything's good.
That's
but you
what
see-
happens in front of the camera.
But you see two men who are friends greet each other, they're often very awkward and they go in maybe for a, sideways hug or
Sure.
nice firm handshake, but they're awkward about it. It's okay for athletes, for guys to.
Well, they're in camouflage. They're wearing sports uniforms. They've got shoulder pads and everything. So there's so much masculine language in everything they're doing and what they're wearing. I'm a poet as well as a novelist, and what I noticed at a certain point, I just started to notice when any poet, let's say from about the age of 40 up, so from about 15 years younger than me onward, any male poet in the country. If he's most of them, if they're straight guys, they've adopted some kind of sport, whether it was boxing for me when I was young, and then hockey. And I started to notice, and I thought, this is just like we're adopting a kind of masculine disguise to give ourselves permission to be poets. Because when you're a poet, I mean, if you don't have emotion in your poetry, as far as I'm concerned, you got nothing, right? So you're having to engage with that emotional side of yourself. You're having to express it if you want the poems to be any good. So in North America especially, you don't see this nearly as much in Europe, where it's okay to be a poet and wear a beret and sit in the cafe and smoke cigarettes with your male friends and not have a sport and not adopt this masculine camouflage. In North America, maybe partly because we're so anti-intellectual, but also so homophobic, male poets especially will always adopt this persona. And Al Purdy, our best-known poet, is probably the best example of it. And I don't say this as a put-down of Al. I loved him. He's a friend. But he very much adopted this sort of beer hall bard persona, this hick persona, this tough guy persona, and did in fact beat people up at times if they insulted him. And I think it was a persona. I saw him in other moments when he would just talk about the poems he loved. He loved these poems, and he would talk about it, but then the disguise would emerge again.
It goes back to and I don't know where it began, but at a certain point, femininity became synonymous with weakness. And men suppress any sort of demonstration of what is believed to be weakness, and in this ridiculous notion, I grew up with nothing but females around me, and let me tell you.
And they had us. They had children. I mean,
course
they're
they
way
did.
tougher than us. So where did this idea of weakness come from? Is it a 19th century thing, the weak sex, the Victorian
Well, it goes back
term?
before that. I mean,
It's before that.
Yeah, way long before that. But somewhere, femininity, weakness, expression that's associated with female expression suddenly becomes evidence of your vulnerability, and vulnerability means peril. And so men have, Norman Mailer, for example, for Christ's sake, these guys going to the gym long after it makes sense, boxing and pounding away at each other. I mean, what's that all about? I think it's a sign of deep emotional insecurity and stupidity at the end of the day. So mercifully, we're getting past that, and someday it'll.
I think, just listening, Linden, to what you just said, we're talking about a real North American construct.
Yeah.
There are a lot of cultures where
Yeah.
men are much more comfortable with physical
Yeah.
contact. And they'll have
Well,
to walk together,
Pasha's book, where men in the subcontinent, they walk around holding
Holding
hands.
hands, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, in Cyprus, in reference to one of your books, there you will see six, adult men at the beach together. You would not really see that here, and they're all sitting close and they're talking and they're mostly close. Also, French Canadians, just from our own
Right.
culture, are a lot more. They're a lot closer. They show a lot more affection. They show a lot more emotion. So I think that the Anglo male certainly has those barriers, but I'm not sure that all male, you know, as to your point as well, all cultures are the same emotionally for male. And you, Linden, talk about, you know, femininity being, you know, seen as weakness, but I also think that, you know, a lot of males can be afraid of not the weakness, but the softness. Right? Thank you.
I'm not championing this this syndrome.
Yeah, I think it's something that we, you know, the three of us seem to be trying to write against.
Yeah.
It's just like trying to access that vulnerability and that emotion and showing some of the distances, particularly between fathers and sons, right? And how we try to bridge those gaps with the, you know, limited tools that we have in the work. There's a woman at the back of this.
Yeah, two people.
It's also about patriarchy, and for men are trained to be strong because they have to be in control. And I don't know if this is abstract or if I'm a bit odd, but I see this breakdown in gender. I mean, the Bay is no longer having boys and girls sections of clothing. They're combining them now. There's no boy and girl. So we know now that children are allowed to say, well, I want to be a girl, I want to be transgender or whatever. And I see this in my field of feeling and experiencing life as a breakdown in patriarchy, because in 25 years we're going to be a different culture, and we are already different, and we're moving towards something that is moving out of that control. I mean, if we look at our experiences of women who have jobs, who are professionals in universities, lawyers, doctors, this never occurred 25 years ago. Only men had those jobs. So now we're moving into another phase of this, and I see it completely as a breakdown in patriarchy and a way of no gender. So who are we? We are a different type of human being, and we are going to experience ourselves very differently in the next coming years. So anyway, those are my insights. So.
I just had one more. The very fact that we had to choose a word that didn't really exist except from the Greek androgynous for this kind of thing, it means that we're scared of it. Also, the 12-year-old whiskey and the cigar is still an archetype that they push in movies, you know, in popular culture, to try to say, are you a man? Can you hold your alcohol? Well, yeah, you can hold it. You can also drink it.
12-year-old whiskey and a cigar sounds fantastic to me. So,
I'm 57. I love that stuff. But you know, is that an image of a man or is that a Marlboro?
no, I think a lot of women would like the 12-year-old whiskey and
yeah.
a cigar too, right? So yeah, but
My wife cleans it out on me, and I should read something, shouldn't I?
yeah, Linden, because it's 9:29.
Oh, okay, sure.
Sorry.
I'm not in a rush.
Sorry. No, I have a question because I feel like, I mean, I'm young and I don't know very much, and I want to ask people who I feel like have more insight. What I feel like there's a large impact in casual conversation with men and women, where we kind of perpetuate these really, really awful, you know, the things that ignore androgyny. So they disengage from the idea that women inherently have masculine, like typically like hegemonic masculine qualities, and vice versa. In like something as simple as like my parents being like, oh, you know, that's my wife and she's gonna wonder when I'm coming home, or some stupid thing like that. And like everybody does that. Like obviously not everybody, that's globalizing, but most people do that, where they just like casually talk about their partners or their friends' partners in this way that's like, well, this is just the way that it's accepted that we talk about it. So even if I don't believe in this and I think it's stupid and I think that I don't want to perpetuate it, I'm gonna perpetuate it. And like, what I feel like, what do you think the actual implications of those kind of casual remarks is?
All this stuff is how we reify power. Like this, one of the back mentioned patriarchy. This is how this, like, the casual stuff is the texture of patriarchy.
Mm-hmm.
That's like all of our interactions is how that power is reified socially. But like, I don't know. At the same time, I'm a fiction writer. You know what I mean? That's why I got quiet when we were talking. Like, this is a discussion for sociologists. I don't have this training. You know, like I wrote a novel that explores some of this stuff in a dilettantish way, and like I'm not an expert on gender. I mean, I have some sort of feeling. So when you're saying like you wanted us to talk about it, like I don't know. I know academics who study this stuff and have for decades, and they're the people who talk about it. Like, I want to hear Linden read.
I thought that this was about fathers and sons. I read their books. I wrote one. And the overarching kind of theme is that there is a difficulty in the relationship between fathers and sons. Now, in my own personal experience, I would say an awful lot of that is related to difficulties in the relationships between mothers and fathers. And kids being torn one way or the other, or being conflicted in identity because one parent or the other has diminished the other parent, without fully understanding that by diminishing the other parent, you're diminishing the kids that look up to the parent. But that's a much larger subject, and I do believe that an awful lot of the gender difficulties that we experience and that eat into our psyches and that cause us so many problems emotionally and psychologically as we go through life, or just so many challenges. We don't all have problems, but we all have challenges. And they do definitely go back to male-female relationships, whether it's parental or mother and son, father and daughter, and the rest of it. It's very difficult. And one of the themes in this book, I think all the fathers are dead. Pasha's is dead, yours is dead, mine is dead from page 1. And that is probably the worst case scenario, because that generation, even my generation, has a hard time connecting to the son. The daughters tend to be a bit more aggressive in establishing a connection. I've found that because I've got 3 of them. The boys are much more like me. They like, let's just get on with it. It's like, just get the boat in the water, fish. But where the father is dead, so I want to read a little bit. In the book I wrote, The Only Cafe, there's a father who is dead from page 1. We find out a lot about him as we go through, but an awful lot of what we find out about him is because his son, who was estranged, is absolutely obsessed with who he was and why he's dead, and connection between the fact that who he was may be an explanation of why he's dead. So I'm going to tell you all something that the son doesn't know, which is where Dad kind of went off the rails because he was present at the death of his own father. And it was in 1976 in Lebanon at the beginning of the Civil War. They lived in a place called Sidon, which is south of Beirut. And the section I'm going to read was, the dad was from Sidon, the mom was from a place called Damour, which is halfway to Beirut from Sidon. And every year the family would go to Damour for a celebration. But this was a particularly difficult year because the Civil War was beginning up, and what they couldn't have known was that Damour was about to be overrun and an awful lot of the people there slaughtered. But anyway, I'll just read this little bit, and the overall conversation seems to have evolved past the subject matter of our books. But I'll give a read, and then we can talk about whatever we talk about. January 8th, 1976. It was 2 days past the Epiphany, the beginning of the annual family excursion to Damour for the reunion of his mother's clan. It would be of an indefinite duration this year because of the unsettled situation in Saida. Who could have known on that quiet morning, January 8th, 1976, that shots fired on local fishermen on a noisy day a year earlier would start a war that would last more than a quarter century? Who could have predicted that this thriving, ancient city would become a slaughterhouse? Brittle winter sunshine. The little yellow car was piled high inside and out with boxes of belongings, heavy carpets tightly rolled and strapped to the roof rack. Mother amid the baggage in the back seat. Miriam, her baby, and her husband in the front. He and his father were staying back, afraid to leave their home unoccupied. And there was work to be done at the harbor, fishing gear and boat in need of repairs for having missed most of the autumn fishing because of the political unrest, the rising throb of violence all around. Freezing drizzle fell that evening as he and his father made their way home from the shore. He can't remember conversation, perhaps because there was none. His father was a quiet man, taciturn and unafraid. They took no particular notice of the Fatah gunmen. For weeks they'd been venturing out of squalid Ain el-Hilwa, wolf packs on the prowl, flexing their authority. But his father saw no need for caution. He belonged here. These men with guns were aliens. They approached quietly. He remembers that there were 7 weapons casually slung. They stop. The barrels of the weapons slightly raised. The leader beckons. He is young. Come, papers. Pierre's father is sullen as he removes an ID card from his pocket, hands it over. A boy little older than Pierre now stands before him, a hostile barrier that separates him from his father. The boy is perhaps 17. His voice is raw. Fuck your sister. Kesiktak. Pierre understands instinctively the need for silence. He has grown accustomed to existential peril since this pestilence began, the expanding menace from the south. Ain el-Hilwa, Mia, Mia. He has heard his father speak of the peace and the civility before the Palestinians arrived, this flood of garbage flushed into Jordan by the Jews and now into Lebanon, fugitives from King Hussein. Fuck your sister and your mother, the boy repeats, waving the barrel of the AK-47. The leader speaks sharply to the boy. Akra, shut your mouth. Pierre suddenly feels more secure, even though he can hear the rising indignation in the conversation between his father and the leader, and the angry voices of the others adding to the tension. His father shouts back at his accusers, accusing them. Pierre feels panic, but senses that there is still an element of reason that will turn down the flame before this pot boils over. The leader, he is slim, with dark hair clipped short. He has the drawn, bewhiskered look of poverty, but also a certain commanding dignity. Pierre stands at the boy in front of him. There's something unusual in his face, and then he realizes one eye is seriously out of sync with the other. One eye looking left, the other looking right, and slightly tilted toward the sky. He is suddenly less menacing. Pierre feels a sudden crazy impulse to mock him. Eben Charmuta. Ahwal, cross-eyed motherfucker. I wouldn't touch your sister if she looks like you, fuckface. He feels better, redeemed by his own aggression, if only in his imagination. The boy in front of him is sneering, as if he reads Pierre's mind. Piece of shit. Afraid to say it? I'll show you. He cranks the weapon. Clack, clack. Stay with him, the leader says to the boy. One of the others shoves Pierre's father roughly, and they walk away, propelling Pierre's father before them until they are gone from view. The wall-eyed boy now looks uncertain. He looks behind him to see where his companions have gone. Then he turns back to Pierre. Run, he whispers. Pierre hesitates. straining to see where they have taken his father. "Fucking run," the boy says, now angry. Pierre backs away, hands raised. The boy raises the assault rifle. Pierre turns and runs on legs that are perilously unsteady, knees of jelly nearly buckling beneath him. Behind him, a sudden burst of gunfire. He stumbles, then recovers and sprints around the corner just as a second burst of gunfire sends a spray of concrete fragments into the side of his face and down the right side of his body. Down a darkened alleyway. He sees a cellar door ajar. He shoulders through, down a stone stairway into darkness. He slips, falls backward, and reaches instinctively to break his fall, but his hand is now plunged into what he knows is human shit, overpowering stink. He realizes he is not alone. A child whimpers. A baby starts to wail. 2 women in the darkness, children huddled around them. He flees back up the stairs, furiously wiping his contaminated hand on his pants leg, too terrified for nausea. The streets are silent. There's a rising wind, and the icy drizzle stings. He stoops. He scrubs the befouled hand in a puddle, fights an impulse to go looking for his father. In his heart, he already knows the futility. He makes his way in the darkness back through the port, through the passages and the byways familiar to the fishermen, until he finds his father's boat among the others on the beach. Upside down, he crawls under. Fast forward 40 years. Dad is now in Canada, and he is spending some time on a boat. In the cabin of the Miriam, he fills a glass with water. He opened a can of sardines. In the cooler, there was bread and cheese and beer. The phone had been silent for what felt like hours. This is what security should feel like. Yes, he told himself, I feel safe here. Perhaps Kennedy was right. Give it a few more days. He thought of his son and had a sudden, overwhelming urge to call him, but he had no idea how to start the conversation. His diary was on the table beside the cell phone. He opened it. There were 200 pages left in his 2007 journal, 191 days, 9 blank pages for significant addresses, notes. He would use them all. A letter to a stranger, Cyril Bashir Cormier, his son. He wrote, I would rather be remembered as an interesting father than a good one. He set the pen down, rubbed his face, picked the pen up, bent the journal back until it cracked, then set it down, now flat, wrote, maybe we will talk. Yes. Would you even want that? Someday, perhaps, if there is time. If so, remember this, and tell me if I'm wrong, that it wasn't enough for me to be an interesting parent and a bad one. I'm open to persuasion. But you will have to tell me first, what are the qualities of a father who can accurately be described as good? That's the deal. Because if I can believe that it might have been possible to have been a good father, then it might be possible to believe that anyone, father, mother, sibling, stranger, can be considered good in any role. At this moment I have doubts. And then he wrote, to understand your father, you must know and understand another man. His story is in many ways my story. I cannot tell you with any confidence even who he is, if he is a good man or a bad man. I do not know. He lives in a world of unreality. He is close to who and what I was. He goes by Ari.
Maybe we could talk a little bit. How much time do we have? Loads. Great.
15 minutes.
Yeah. Maybe we could talk a bit about how fathers haunt
Well,
books.
it just occurred to me that, and if you read books, I think I'll say by male writers, because I can't do a quick enough mental survey to think about recent novels I've read by women. But I think an inordinate number of fathers are dead on page 1, as you say, of novels by male novelists of almost any age. And I wonder if we're all familiar with the idea that it's necessary to try to be the hero of your own life. Another way to put that is the protagonist of your own life. So maybe, in a way, the father has to be dead for our protagonist to be the protagonist in the novel. You know what I mean?
That's very Freudian, but yeah, all right. Yeah, I mean, my book is it is a speculative fiction in that I took my life and twisted it, and my father is alive, and the father of the book is dead, and I am a relatively happy, satisfied person, and the character in the book is not, and doesn't write, and is a sort of lapsed writer and everything else. So, yeah, like the death of the father was sort of like normal literary device.
Right.
Like cleansing myself of my own father or something.
Are you, yeah, I didn't mean that. I just, anyway, have you found that a lot of people who've been interviewing you or talking about your book have just sort of assumed that your actual father is dead instead of asking, or not even asking at all? Because after all, it's a novel, right? It's not autobiographical.
This is something I talked to David Chariandi about a lot. And I don't know if people have read Brother. You will. You will be reading it after it wins the Giller Prize, so enjoy it. It's great. And David is he's a scholar, and he writes a lot about diasporic African Caribbean literature. And he feels that writers of color are especially susceptible to this judgment that we align ourselves with the narrators of our books. I don't know if it's true. We've had conversations that are very convincing. But I certainly noticed that in my book there's a lot of conflation with me and my life, and you know, it's sort of deliberate. I did do things in the book where I pulled things from my life and created some parallels and created some points of intersection in order to play with the fact and fiction. So I was sort of ready for it, and I think the novel invites it in some ways.
Yeah.
But I also I think it's important to you know, if a novel is a novel and not a work of nonfiction, to read it as a novel and not a statement about the author or anything like that. I mean, you have done writing. This book not, but you have done writing that is a little closer to your own sort of life experience.
Yeah, when I've written a bunch of short stories set in Japan that sort of sprawl over 2 different books, and those ones are a little more autobiographical, and yet they're not. So I'm just playing. In fact, in at least 2 or 3 of the stories, the protagonist is named Steve. So I was sort of inviting this trouble, and then I got frustrated when people assumed it was me, and I thought, why am I getting frustrated? Of course they're going to assume it's you. The character's name is Steve, and he's an English teacher in Japan.
I think the assumption is a kind of dynamism that the book should invite, and I think
Right.
it creates a kind of reading experience. I don't mind as a reader reading something like Elena Ferrante. I don't know if people have read those novels, and wondering how much of the author's life is in the book. Like, I think that creates a layer of engagement with the book that isn't wrong. But I also think it's important that we don't then judge the author based on things in the character.
Exactly.
And I say that like defensively because my characters are really dickhead.
Yeah. Well, in a way, if you are inviting that, the assumption that maybe that character is you, you've got to be a little braver about making your protagonist unlikable. And you have to make your protagonist unlikable in at least some ways, or he or she is not human, right?
I think so. I
Yeah.
think it's relatively easy just to write a book about a likable person. Like in my novel, the character has written a book previously about a very likable. He's made a very
Right.
likable version of himself in order to be liked. David Foster Wallace wrote about this all the time, that he struggles in his work with the need to be liked, the need to be thought intelligent, the need for his books to be a kind of conduit between him as a person and the reader as a person, and that he feels like his worst are felt, and perhaps never got over it because he took his own life, but he felt that was the major flaw in his work, was that he was using the books as a way, as a kind of ingratiation to a reader. And I mean, I still think much of David Foster Wallace's work was some of the best work of the latter half of the 20th century. I think he wrote some incredible stuff. So, but I do think that that's something that my character in the book has done and feels, in retrospect, was disingenuous and false. And it's definitely something that the book, my novel, tries to do the opposite of.
Yeah.
It almost goes the opposite. Like the characters are very unlikable, detestable in many
I didn't find them unlikable. I thought they were, they do bad things and they explode. They throw tantrums, all the things that I do and everyone else in this room has done at some point. So I didn't find them unlikable. I just found them
they're
very
real.
human. I got pissed off at them at times in a way as if
the
they're real
interesting
people.
thing, like, I'm from a totally different generation, and I knew them all. I knew all these guys,
Yeah, sure.
especially Matt.
Yeah. But are you in your work? Are you invested? Do you think that? I mean, you might have missed the start of the conversation, but we were just talking the idea of likability. Like, if you want readers to like your.
Yeah, but see, I was told once by a fellow who's a friend of mine, and he's very big, in the world, right? And he says you can't. He says your character has to be likable, and I totally disagree. Your character has to be real, and the character has to be embedded in a story that is kind of real, and that people can identify with. I don't think anybody particularly identifies with likable. What the hell does that mean? I mean, likable is a one-on-one kind of situation. Anybody who is universally likable is faking it, I think.
Yeah.
He's a politician. and I think people who are truly likable are likable kind of one-on-one, and they're dislikable. I often, because I was on TV for a long time, I often run into this phenomenon where I'm on the subway, and somebody comes up and says, "Love your work, man, love you, man," and all that. And it just doesn't register with me, because I know that sitting over there is an individual that hate your guts. I'd like to get up there and hit you in the head, because, but one of the great saving graces of our civilization is that the people who think that seldom do it, whereas people who think nice things will come up and say, "Love your work."
Yeah.
So I think we just have to be really careful about this whole concept of likability, because if we get invested in it, then we start to become phonies.
Right.
Yeah, and I mean, so much of the way that we interact now, or the way that some people interact on social media, is based in likability. It's about getting likes, literally.
Yeah,
Getting
Likes,
people
exactly.
To click the like button and be liked. And in order to be liked, I think one has to be false.
Yeah, Russell
Yeah.
Smith had a great little piece in the Globe and Mail the other day about the selfie thing. He was on the beach the other day, and he was looking at all these young people, really beautiful young people, who were so totally into selfies. But the thing about each selfie was a kind of sort of a betrayal of who they really were. The expression on the face was not their face. It turned their face into something that was in their imaginations about what their face is supposed to look like. And we are, social media and sort of contemporary pressures, especially on the young people, are turning us into this kind of cult of likability.
Mm-hmm. And I talked about this in One Impact the other day, and it's like, I feel like fiction is a space that can be a little more honest.
Absolutely.
Fiction should be this
It
space
has
for
to be.
Yeah, like
It has to be.
people, I think characters can do things that are likable also. Like, the
Sure.
character doesn't have to be only detestable. We don't have to make all our books about Hitler
No.
and Pol Pot. But I think that, the humanity, as you're speaking, like the complexity of humanity involves like the characters doing things that are endearing. Like, I think that the scene that I read, I think that the character, it's a moment in the book where the character softens a little bit. Like, he's just been beaten down, and he has this moment of a bit of grace with this kid where they sing together. And that scene is an anomaly in the book, but I think it's important to have, like, if the book were only the sort of misanthrope, hating everything, and being miserable, it would be insufferable. And it's also not true. Like,
And your guy Stratus, I really connected with that guy, and you redeemed him at the end with his tremendous heroism.
Right.
This character in my book, Ari, the ex-Israeli intelligence officer, it would have been so easy to paint him with horns and as a kind of a stereotypical bad guy, but he's not. He's a deep, thoughtful fellow who has deep, thoughtful reasons for having spent a life of, manipulation and violence and
Yeah,
destruction.
he gets more and more complex as the story goes on. You realize.
And I think that it's incumbent upon us, who are supposed to have some understanding of human nature, to present human nature in all its ambiguities and weaknesses and strengths.
yeah, and to cultivate empathy. Like, I think that fiction is a you know, we can, in a culture that seems to be devaluing empathy and giving us fewer and fewer avenues to express empathy with other people, and the more we relate to each other through screens. I mean, there have been, you know, a lot of academic work done about this, that like, it is actually, there's a deficit of empathy that's happening the more you relate to other people through screens versus face-to-face interaction. So I feel that, you know, in the novel, the space can be a place, you know, all of our characters should elicit empathy, whether it's, which is very different than likability, very different than sympathy.
Yeah.
But the idea that, you know, for instance, you know, in Steve's book, the kind of villainous figure in your book is a figure who's humiliated very early in the book. So we see something about this. Yeah, Paulette, yeah. The character who is much more complex than just a straight villain, which is a kind of, you know, boring archetype.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that for me, the books that I like are the ones where that kind of make me see people as whole people. You know, if that's what the book is doing, the book is invested in sort of expressing character in that way.
Because
Like,
people are whole people.
Sorry?
People are whole people. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
and I think that they have to come across that way. And the cartoonizing of people is evidence of some sort of serious weakness in the imagination of whoever is telling the story.
No,
About is that just a prompt?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, do you want to masculinity and fathers?
What was the question?
Just a prompt
A prompt about what?
to talk about fathers.
Our fathers.
Yeah.
We want to hear all about mine?
Read the book.
No. My father was a man that I didn't get to know very well through no fault of his own. He was a really nice guy, and he grew up in a place where he had no access to any kind of formal education, so he was totally self-educated. He never went to school. He didn't even learn to speak English until he was about 9. He spoke Scottish Gaelic. And he, when at the age of 17 or so, where do you take that? So the only place he could take it was into the hardest labor in the hard rock mining industry. And that's where he spent most of his life. And I never really got to know him until I was working my way to a university and I was stuck for work. And I said, can you get me a job? And he did. He got me a job as an underground laborer. And we actually roomed together in a bunkhouse.
Wow.
In the bush. And it was really a kind of a healthy experience because I had no father-son baggage with him. I was like rooming with an older guy who made a lot of strange noises in the night and smelled bad. And in the evenings we would drink beer and play cribbage, and then go to sleep and go to work, and that formed a kind of a basis. And I said, you know what, this is a nice guy. I'd like to get to know him better, but I never got the chance. He dropped dead one day as a consequence of the hard life that he spent in these camps. But I was left with a peculiarity, a curiosity, a deep, obsessive curiosity about who this guy was, and it probably filters all through the fiction that I write.
But did he never play father with?
Did he never play father?
With you?
No. He wouldn't have known how. I think my mother lived, he died at 50, my mother lived to be 100, so she had twice as much time. So she has told me that when I was really small, too small to remember, he was very sort of like typically young dad, but I don't remember anything growing up of any kind of connection on that level, and it was only when I was about 18 and we roomed together in a mining camp for a couple of summers that I sort of got to connect.
That's an amazing story. I think there were a couple more questions. Helga, you had your hand up, didn't you?
Well, it's, excuse me. You know, Stephen, your book sort of grew from being traumatized by a car salesman on the Danforth and learning about Cyprus.
Carpet, yeah.
Pardon me. And, your book, your connection is to, aspects of your life and heritage. But Linden, where on earth did this story come from?
Well, that came from my life. Because as a journalist, I covered some wars, and I covered a lot of violent situations. And one of the most violent and long-running situations that I got dropped into periodically was the civil war in Lebanon. And I can't say I was unprepared for what I was going to bump into there, but I was certainly unprepared for one aspect of it, which was horrific massacre in 1982. And I didn't, I did the journalism, and I came away and moved on to a bunch of other stories. And it wasn't like post-traumatic stress stuff that I was haunted this, haunted that. I wasn't. I mean, but I was haunted by certain insights that came to me when I was involved. I was in this particular camp where 2,000 people had been massacred in the previous 3 days. And I sort of got a sense of a certain aspect of human nature that I couldn't put into journalism. It was just too, it was too abstract. And I carried it around for 30 years. And then I decided I'm going to tell a story about a guy who is trying to find out who his father was, and his father was possibly a criminal in this civil war. And then I suddenly realized I'm going to use that stuff. So that's where the story came from, basically. It came from journalism.
Hi. I want to take the conversation back. A minute ago, you were talking about how a lot of folks would ask you if this is your real life in a book, basically. And I think in a way that it happens a lot to writers of color like yourself and myself, where people are like, "Is this story about you?" I get that all the time when I'm promoting my book as well. And I think it is a racialized issue. Whenever a writer of color writes a book, people are like, especially that we write about our cultures, we end up being connected to the characters that we write, while Memoir of a Geisha was written by a white person and nobody says that he was a geisha, you see what I mean? So I think that, I don't know if that's a question or a comment, but how do you feel about being racialized in a certain way? Or for you writing about a war that widely reported on it, and that gives you path to be able to give true reflections on the lives of the people that you're creating on the page. Do you feel that you are being stereotyped as a writer of color and all of your characters are reflective of who you are? And do you feel that you are stepping into the stories of others in a way?
I've never really felt that way because nobody knows what I am. I was just in Italy, everybody thought I was Italian. The only place that I go and nobody thinks that I'm from there is India. So, the stereotyping isn't something I've experienced, but I think that the book is about a kind of resistance to ways of exploring that kind of identity in fiction, that I think there are certain channels and certain modes that have been established that are the ways these stories are told and the way these stories are kind of allowed to be told. And this book kind of is about dismantling all those structures and looking at them as a set of tropes and archetypes and cliches and how limiting those become. And so as far as me being racialized, I have been called every racial name wrongly, but rarely the right one. So I don't ever really feel, and even in India, like Kashmiris, I have a Kashmiri, my father's Kashmiri, my mom is white from Britain, but I have Kashmiri relatives who live in India who are stopped on the street and asked, like, "Oh, where are you from?" Because Kashmiris are very light. My whole family has blue eyes. I am one of the darker people in my family, and my mom is white. I have relatives that have reddish kind of blood, like many Syrians as well, right? Mm-hmm. There's a kind of Central Asian. So the Kashmiris in India, and especially Hindu Pandit Kashmiris who have been kind of pushed out of Kashmir into the rest of India and around the world, are not only people without a home and that they can't return to Kashmir, but even in their own country they're kind of really foreign. So I think I don't know if that's something I've inherited from my father or from my family, but it's like a sense of identity that inherently resists stereotype. So it's not something I struggle with. It's something actually, like, I'm glad I'm a writer. If I wasn't, I'd probably go crazy, because it's something that's really fertile. It's like a very fertile territory for fiction. It's like tons of angst and materials that I dig into.
I'm not racialized.
You are. Just, white people always say this. White people are racialized, and being white is a race. Yeah, like you are. It's just.
Yeah, but nobody pays any attention to it. This is the thing. Nobody finds it interesting.
Yeah, but we should.
I often wished I was an Indian or a Chinese person, or wished I had some kind of racialized identity.
White people do.
Yeah, but I grew up in a totally homogeneous place where everybody was the same. I mean, there was Catholics and Protestants. That was pretty serious. And but the rest of it was, it was all fairly homogeneous, and there was no problem. I mean, my whole drive it comes from this obsessive need to tell stories. And I take it back to when I was a small kid, and all kids are always trying to get attention. And I noticed that in the community I grew up in, which is a population of 150, that people who were generally regarded in the community as being riff-raff, alcoholic, mentally sort of challenged people, if they could tell a story, they were welcome in the house. And they would sit there. Some of them were eccentric as hell, and they'd sit there and you'd be spellbound with their stories. They would take little events in the community and turn them into stories. And I realized, like, if you can tell a story, people will listen to you. And it became something. So when I reached a certain age, at a certain time in our national cultural history, the only way you could get paid for telling a story was to go to work in the news media, which I did. And then eventually I clawed my way out of it.
I'm just gonna, this is an amazing conversation, and
We're out of wine.
Yeah.
Beer. I thought it was going to keep filling there were going to be self-filling glasses.
we are past 10 o'clock, but I don't want to rush you off the stage, but I think at this point we won't take any more questions. If you want to continue with the conversation, you're welcome to do so. No,
In front of a totally empty room. We'll just keep talking. But Linden, what did you mean?
There's also an opportunity if you do have books. There are tables at the back, and continue the conversation.
Get a refill.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Well, thank you all.
Napatanio Haro.